Well, hi, and welcome to another edition of Adam's Music Box, where today I want to pardon myself and pay tribute to the great Ed Mann, who we lost at the very end of May of this year, and I didn't want to let his sad death go unnoticed. Now, Ed Mann was a master of the pitched percussion. In the percussion world, there are many ways to classify instruments. There are the membranophones, which are a drum with a skin head pulled over it, so your drums on a drum set, your bongos, your congas, your timpani, your marching drums, even though most of them are made with synthetic membranes these days, which there's a joke in there somewhere. And then, of course, there's metallic percussion, including the cymbal family of West Asia, the tam tam or gong family from Northeast Asia, and of course the mallet family of percussion, which has roots in Africa, refined and sort of rarefied, if you will, in much of Latin America and Europe. And Ed Mann was a master of all of these, but he was best known for his mallet percussion, your xylophones, your vibraphones, your marimba. And he played all of those things in Frank Zappa's bands over the years. He was a very consistent member of Zappa's bands, and he was, in fact, with Zappa between 77 and that final tour of 88, which means that Ed Mann was playing in Zappa's bands during what I call Zappa's Renaissance, his golden age. Some would even say Indian summer, but I think Zappa from the late 70s till the end of his life was at his peak. The compositions were more biting and scathing and more sophisticated than ever. The stage shows were better performed than ever. Not that there was ever a bad Zappa show live, but the bands just got tighter and tighter, and his sort of neo big band, if you will, that he took on tour in 1988 was really la creme de la creme. It was the best. It had so many musicians that could do so many things, so much versatility, and the band knew so many compositions that no two nights needed to be the same on that tour. And in fact, no two nights were. We all know what happened. It was cut short early because of tensions in the band revolving around the bass player, a great bass player, I might add, Scott Tunis. But let's talk about the mallet percussion in Frank Zappa's music, because if anyone were to associate a single family of instruments with Frank Zappa, I would say that it would be percussion in general and mallet percussion specifically. And I can already hear the people saying, but wait, man, Zappa was a guitar player. Well, yes, he was, but he actually came to the guitar very late in life. He learned it, I think, when he was around 18, which for people that grew up playing guitar since they were kids, like Eddie Van Halen, for instance, it was kind of late. Prior to that, he studied orchestral composition and percussion. And even though his sort of televised debut was as a percussionist using drumsticks to play a bicycle on the very entertaining and very ahead of its time Steve Allen show, there was something that Zappa always felt affinity towards when it came to percussion. And I think that a lot of that was because of Zappa's the influence that 20th century orchestral music and chamber music had on Zappa. And when you look at the orchestration and what of major orchestral pieces and what changed between the 19th and the 20th century, the string section remained the same. It was large in the 19th century and remained large in the 20th. The trumpet, the trombone, the tuba, those were the French horn, were established brass instruments. The clarinet, English horn or cor anglais, the oboe, the bassoon, the flute, those were established woodwinds. The saxophone never really made it into a lot of orchestral music, although it was much more common in the 20th century than the 19th, or it was almost entirely absent from orchestral music. But the biggest change is the percussion. 19th century orchestral percussion was timpani, and usually timpani alone, and then sometimes you'd see crash cymbals, bass drum, maybe a snare or military drum, and occasionally some other things like you'd have castanets and bizet, etc., but tambourine and some Russian music. But in general, it really revolved around the timpani, with cymbals being in second place. When you go to a concert hall and see a lot of percussion on stage, it's guaranteed that you're going to listen to a piece from the 20th or 21st century. And Zappa was a 20th century composer, first and foremost. His music was really chamber music played for a rock and roll audience. He kind of alluded that to that himself. And Ed Mann, as the mallet percussionist from 77 till the end, was really a central part of that because the percussion, the mallet percussion in Zappa's bands, whether Ruth Underwood, who played from 68 to 77, or Ed Mann, who then was her successor in the mallet percussion section of various Frank Zappa bands, it was a lead instrument. It wasn't merely there to add flourishes to the drum set or to accent various things. It was a lead instrument, and it featured on not every song, but a lot of them. And it really was a kind of signature thing for Zappa. You could say that some bands broke the boundaries by having electric violin, bands like Mahavishnu Orchestra, Kansas, Zappa for a while when he had Jean-Luc Ponty. But what really made Zappa's band unique in terms of its sonic palette from other bands that had your standard keyboards of all sorts, electric guitar, bass, drum set, which of course Zappa had, and many vocalists in the band, whether it was Ike Willis, whether it was Bobby Martin, whether it was Mr. White, whose first name is slipping me right now because it's one of those days. But the point is, it was the mallet percussion that really gave it that extra Zappa sound, on top of all the other things that gave it the Zappa sound. If you were listening to complex music played by instruments that were relatively reminiscent of your typical rock and roll or fusion band, it was those mallets that really kept things apart. And when you watch some of Ed's solos that were captured live on several of the tours that Zappa did in the 80s, for instance, Does Humor Belong in Music? Ed Mann captured there. The Palladium shows and some of the high quality bootlegs, particularly the Barcelona, Spain show of the 88 tour. You can really see just what a virtuoso he is, both as a soloist and as an accompanist. And he was, of course, versed not just on mallet percussion, but on all sorts of pitched metallic percussion, on the membranophone family, on the random little handheld percussive instruments, and on keyboards, because he occasionally would play keyboards too. An all around super, super talented musician. And the stuff he did after Zappa was, of course, just as artistically interesting. But he will, of course, always be known for the band and the band leader that gave him his biggest audience ever. And that was, of course, Frank Zappa. And of all of the members of that great 88 band, Mann was one of my favorites because, again, that percussive sound, the tuned percussion, the mallets. It's not an easy instrument to play. A lot of percussionists would argue that it's more difficult to play well than a drum set. It might be easier to play poorly, but that was certainly not anything Ed Mann would ever do, and it was certainly nothing that Zappa would ever tolerate. So, a belated fond farewell to Ed Mann. Put on any of the great records from that 88 tour if you want to really hear him make a jazz noise here. He's all over that. And you can also hear him all over The Best Band You've Never Seen in Your Life and Broadway the Hard Way, as well as so many other albums. You can't go wrong with any of them. Rest in peace, Ed Mann. Like, subscribe. We'll, of course, see you next time. Take care.